We are impressed by our speaker's credentials. We are awed at his resume, but it is his ongoing leadership to issues of peace and justice that makes it an honour for the Mauro Centre of Peace and Justice to invite the Honourable Lloyd Axworthy to deliver the second annual Saul Kanee Lecture. Please join me in welcoming the Honourable Lloyd Axworthy.
I was watching Robin Williams live on Broadway, videotaped the other night. I noticed he always has a ball of water, so I'm just going to repeat his sort of somewhat eclectic style of presentation. Let me first pay proper honor to the President of the University, the Chancellor who's here, to the Rector of St. Paul's and the Board, to Art Mauro and to Naomi, who are sort of in many ways the founders of this occasion, to the Richardson family and to the other sponsors and to members of the advisory group that has brought us all together. And let me also thank you for coming and joining me on Monday afternoon. In that, I must pay special thanks to my mother. Going back several decades, my first effort into the political realm was to run for a nomination in Winnipeg North Centre, and at the nominating meeting there was my mother and my father, one brother, and the family dog. From that point on, my mother was the designated hitter to at least get 10 people out, so she did pretty good in packing the house today, so I thank her for that. I also want to begin with a disclaimer. I'm still a little bit in that transition world between the 30-second clip and actually having to create sentences and paragraphs that have some coherence to them as a sentence. I am, at the one time, totally liberated from having to follow a very carefully crafted script from serious-minded foreign affairs officials. On the other hand, I have found that that liberation has led to sometimes a degree of license in the language. And because we are here in honoring the Mauro Centre about its ability to provide a sense of tolerance between different ethnic and cultural groups, I'm sure that I can borrow your apology. I say that because just very few weeks ago I was invited to speak to a distinguished university audience in Taiwan. And they're pretty formal, as you know, and I gave my talk, and at the end of it, a nice young professor got up and posed this question. He said, Mr. Axworthy, you were a foreign affairs minister for a lot of years. You had to deal with the United States, this huge, powerful country. Do you have any advice to give to us as to how we should deal with a powerful neighbor? Well, in the old days, there would have been a slip of paper immediately kind of put in, sort of saying, you know, dummy up, stupid. You know, that would have come from my sort of speechwriter. But I thought, what the heck? You know, this is sort of I'm on my own, I can kind of be creative. So I said, look, I'm going to tell you an old Manitoba adage, an old Manitoba saying, that dealing with a big, powerful neighbor is like making love to a porcupine. Do it carefully. I'm not sure the Chinese audience quite got the full meaning of what I was saying. In fact, I was pretty sure they didn't, because the next morning, I was invited to a power breakfast, you know, one of these things where they get up at 5:30 in the a.m. to talk about, you know, investments and things of that kind. And as I came into the room and was being introduced, I noticed there was just a slight edge. Well, it was more than slight. They were actually weren't looking at me. So I said to my host, I said, have I committed a little bit of a protocol problem here? I mean, have I done something wrong? He said, well, it may have something to do with the report in this morning's newspaper. And I said, what was that? They said, well, they reported it in the lecture you gave last night at the university when asked the question about how Taiwan should deal with sort of China. Your answer was, well, it's like making love to a concubine. You, you can take it, if you like, as a variation on soft power, Charles, if you like, but so I may fall or lapse into a certain kind of colloquium or axiom, and I'll try to restrain myself. But let me first start off by saying that it is very good to be back in my spiritual home of Manitoba, a place where I grew up and lived and worked for so many years, and particularly to have a chance to pay a tribute to two individuals who were very much part of that growing up and that experience of my generation in this community. For those of us who have had I think the privilege of having our feet stuck in prairie mud for a long time, we realize that we inherit something special. Whether it's just our history and our experience of maybe gathering around the Forks, which is the great gathering circle for our First Nations, or being a home for so many cultural groups that came to this part of the world at the beginning of the century. I always think that just having this huge prairie sky just changes your outlook. You sort of, whatever direction you look, you can see forever. There's no barriers, there's no parameters, there's no sort of blinders on what you want to see. And all that may be true, but I think what is really distinguishing is the fact that we have inherited generation after generation of people in this community who take on the responsibility of being stewards. That it's not just looking after themselves or their families, but also becoming the stewards of a community, recognizing that for a place to work, people must prevail, and that they invest time and effort and commitment. And it is, I think, appropriate and no coincidence that the two people that we're honoring today, Arthur Mauro, for his initiative in establishing a Center on Peace and Justice, is that quintessential steward. I said to a luncheon group today, think about it for a moment. Do you think there are many other places in North America where in a 2 o'clock in the Monday afternoon, there's several hundred people gathered to talk about peace and justice? I don't think so. I think this is an example of what makes us just a little bit different. And it just demonstrates that an understanding of how we in this community really do have something to offer, that we do have something special. I recall giving a talk in Minneapolis a few years ago, and again I was questioned about whether I thought the United States was the indispensable nation. I demurred from answering out of politeness, but I said, I'll tell you what I do believe, is that Canada is the value-added nation, that we know how to put the investment of our human spirit into making things better and different. And again, no one represented that quality more directly and explicitly than Saul Kanee, who was another builder of this community that we belong to. When I first met Saul, he looked at me in that interesting way of his, basically sizing you up. I was just a tyro in the political worlds, and he said, "We may be related." I said, "How so?" He said, "Well, I've discovered that your mother's family comes from a suburb of Melville called Bangor." Now, if any of you have been to Bangor, Saskatchewan, you know that suburb is a fairly fancy description. At last sight, it had one red and white store, one senior's home, and they were tearing up the sidewalk. But of course, Saul had come from Melville, which was the metropolis around which Bangor sort of circulated. And he said, "I'm sure along the way that our paths have crossed in some important kind of connection." I said, "I'm sure there was." He said, "I'm going to keep an eye on you as a result." At the time, I just didn't know how much of a gift that was going to be, because in my world, as an up-and-coming young politician in this community, there was nobody who was more wise, astute, and sometimes acerbic about how to play the political game than Saul Kanee. And I would think that today's generation of politicians should go back and take some lessons from what he established. No one relished the practice and pragmatics of party politics more than Saul Kanee. He was truly a happy warrior in mastering the intricacies of the political game, but always for a reason. Always for a reason. Because Saul, the game had a goal. The game was to enhance and preserve and protect this community and to make sure that Canada maintained its integrity as a country. He was passionate about this country and a great believer in its destiny. And no one believed more fervently the crucial role that party politics, in this case Liberal Party politics, played through its opening of active, serious, controversial public debate. To him, a party was not a machine to gather votes. It was a forum in which differences could be aired and heard and agreements hammered out. And so, if I might, Madam President and others, I just take this moment to pay my own special honor to Saul Kanee and what he taught me about politics, and a lesson that I hope that today's generation will also learn. Okay, global citizenship. That in part was what Saul Kanee was talking about. Sense of responsibility, sense of obligations, sense of standards, sense of norms, sense of goals of where you want to go. And last night at dinner, Jessica Seney, who is the Associate Director of the Mauro Center, was telling us about her research work on how telling stories is a way of resolving conflicts. So I thought I might start with a story. There's an old saying, by the way, that the narrative of politics is not the soliloquy of the state, but it's the human story. It makes us understand what we're involved in. About 7 days ago, actually 7 days to the day, I was in Bogota, Colombia, on behalf of Human Rights Watch. As a board member and chairman of their Americas division, we were asked to go and present a report to the government of Colombia on the plight of child soldiers, young men and women ranging anywhere from the age of 9 to 17 or 18, who have been kidnapped, abducted, recruited into the guerrilla armies, into the paramilitaries, and had suffered the most unimaginable forms of abuse and violation. In one of the little anecdotes in the report that we tabled, it's titled, "You'll Learn Not to Cry." It's the story of a young 12-year-old girl named Angela. And I thought I would just read to you her interview. She said, "I had a friend, Juanita, who got into trouble. We had been friends in civilian life and shared a tent together. The commander said it didn't matter that she was my friend. She had committed an error and had to be killed. I closed my eyes and fired the gun, but I didn't hit her, so I shot again. The grave was right nearby. I had to bury her and put the dirt on top. The commander said, 'Angela, you did very well, even though you started to cry. You'll have to do this again many more times, and you'll have to learn not to cry.'" One young girl, barely moving into adolescence, is being told not to cry. It speaks volumes, it speaks millions of words about the kind of situation that we find being played out around the world every day, every hour, every minute in Congo, Liberia, northern Uganda, any of the major killing fields around the world, which last year took over 300,000 innocent lives, primarily women and children. That doesn't include the 25 million or so refugees or the 40 million displaced people. And of course, after September 11th, we all joined that circle of insecurity. We all became part of that system where hate and violence and mass murder became a way of life, creating a sense of unknown risk, of hidden terrorism, of never knowing when your fundamental freedom to be not to have fear was going to be challenged. It's the dark underworld side of globalism. We are very good at talking about the joys, and there are many, of being interdependent, of having new technologies, of being able to move capital around in seconds, of having a worldwide trade system and investment system. What we don't have quite as good an understanding of is that the underworld of the global world has the same capacity, the same tools, the same technology. The terrorists, the pedophiles, the small drug dealers, the arms dealers. They have set up networks of information and money and finance. They move around the world with an enormous facility. And the same kind of nanosecond that brings suffering into our living rooms via television and internet, they can create to cause that suffering. Let me just give you one example from Colombia. This year alone, drug trafficking will create a $50 billion profit for the purveyors. And if you think that that is some kind of an abstract, academic, way off in the atmosphere kind of issue, where I live now on Vancouver, I see on the east side every single month 20 to 30 young people ODing by the heroin and crack that comes in from Colombia, that's run by the cartels. We're not immune. We can't escape. The kind of plight that Angela faces is the kind of plight that those young people on the east side of Vancouver, to say nothing of around the world, face. Unfortunately, a lot of that underworld goes ignored, goes untouched, goes by the wayside, as we have focused primarily on one aspect of that criminality, the terrorism that occurred in 9/11. It shook every foundation and every assumption we had about the way the world works. Our legal and our political and our social systems have all been undermined. The kind of crash of steel and concrete that took place in the World Trade Center has been followed by an enormous undermining of the foundations of our own society, of our own international society. It's given license to a variety of interventions, substantial increases in arms, huge amounts going into security. And one thing we should recognize coming out of that is that when you define a conflict a certain way, it changes your own living constitution, the rules that you live by. That's what it means. War is not an ephemeral existence. It has this profound, almost tidal wave impact of fundamentally changing the rules of our game, who we are, what kind of citizens we'll be. And equally important, the way in which you make peace out of those conflicts, the way in which you try to resolve those conflicts also shapes and defines and tailors the kind of responsibilities and obligations we have. We need to find new stories, new rationalizations, new laws, new institutions to come to grips with the aftermath of the traumatic period we've been through. We simply can't rely upon our existing institutions or even our textbook standard cliches to give us the answers. Our world post-war 11, post-war Iraq cries out for some creative citizenship. It cries out for a form of civility in global affairs and new sets of rules of law. It calls out for a kind of inclusiveness. And so today I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about our efforts as Canadians, our responsibility to act as global citizens in light of this new underworld that we're dealing with, and how we can do our part. Let me go back for a minute to the trip to Colombia. As I was flying back from Bogota, I sat next to a Canadian business person who is a mining engineer opening up a project in northwest Colombia. He had read the story of our intervention in Colombia on the child soldiers, and he said, "Let me tell you about my experience." He said, "I'm not a diplomat or Human Rights Watch, but he said, I'm a businessman. And I've been doing mining around the world for 40 years. And up until 10 years ago, I had a bottom line, I had a limited risk, I knew exactly what my accountants could tell me about the trade-off between investment and profit and where a mine should work." He said, "But in the last 5 years, I have gone through one of the most amazing transformations of my life." He said, "I realize now that 1/3 of all my investments are going in to providing security for the villagers working in my mine, to provide health programs for them, to begin dealing with the environmental issues. He said, I have now begun to understand that the only way that I can earn a return is to make sure that I invest as a corporate citizen in the well-being and security, and I have a responsibility to do that. This was not somebody who had graduated from a course on ethical imperatives. This was a pretty serious, pragmatic business guy, understanding that his world had changed, and he had to think through how he did business. I met a woman from Carmen, Manitoba in Colombia, who's been in that country for 20 years working with Save the Children, who spends her life sort of up around Medellin, which is one of the really major drug centers, developing small-scale rehabilitation programs for children, knowing that at any moment kidnapping could take place. In fact, it's been kidnapped already once, and says, you know, sometimes you balance off what you do and what you don't do. The point about that is that you can meet Canadians of that kind in every other part of the world. We travel more than any other, proportionally any other group of people in the world. So increasingly in work and travel and education and political engagement, the world has become our precinct. It's where we do business. And it also carries with it, as a result, a political, cultural, even a moral dimension. It's where, as you said, Marshall McLuhan said, we would end up 50 years ago. And there's a very simple conclusion from that interdependency, that we win in a world which is stable, equitable, and cooperative. We lose when it's turbulent, divisive, and unfair. It therefore makes sense as citizens that we do what we can do to help tip the world into a more constructive, fair, equitable world. Not because there is some grand imperative that says we must, but simply because it makes good sense that we take personal responsibility. And you know something? We're not alone. Don't think that we have some noblesse oblige, that we are some kind of promised children. We're not. I want to tell you one other story from the work that I'm presently doing in northern Uganda through our institute at UBC, where we are heavily engaged in the peace process up in that area, a war that's been going on for 40 years. I visited a place called Lachor Hospital, which is about 10 miles outside of Gulu. It's in the northern part of Uganda. It's just very close to the Sudanese border. Lachor Hospital started about 30 years ago by a Canadian woman named Lucille Corti and her Italian husband. They became probably one of the first frontline hospitals to deal with the issue of AIDS before we even knew what to call it. She contacted HIV and she died about 4 years ago, simply through the exposure and the time. Along the way, however, she and her husband trained a cadre of first-class doctors and nurses from northern Uganda, sent them to London, sent them to McGill, sent them to schools. They would come back as first-class medical professionals. So I went to visit the gravesite of Lucille Corti to pay some homage. When I got there, beside that gravesite was a black marble plaque with 12 names on it. It stands in recognition of 12 of those African medical staff who gave their lives just about 2.5 years ago to contain the deadly virus Ebola. It had broken out in the bushes around Gulu, brought there by the soldiers coming back from the Congo. The medical staff at Lachor Hospital recognized that if that virus spread into the camps, spread into the displaced persons camp, which numbered 400,000 people, it would be a wildfire. It would spread and metastasize like nothing else you've ever seen, and it would spread worldwide. So they decided, as citizens, that they would do what they were trained to do and put an end to it. They set up the whole hospital as a quarantine ward, and every case that was reported would come in. Dr. Lukawaya, who was the head medical director, one afternoon was told that a patient was attempting to break out. He had gone berserk through his illness. He went into his room and clutched him to his side to quell his sort of frantic attempts to escape, knowing that it was a sure sentence of death. Dr. Lukia and 11 others of that staff in a period of about a month all gave the ultimate sacrifice, their lives, in this far-off hospital in a part of the world that most Canadians would never have heard about. Which makes me raise with you the question, again, that if a group of African doctors and nurses gave their lives, were they not also acting as global citizens? When they took a decision to arrest the disease that had widespread repercussions for the rest of us, they showed their metals as brothers and sisters and keepers of health on a global scale. Now, they're not going to be on the cover of Time magazine. Nobody will receive a knighthood. Larry King won't interview them. But in terms of that valiant stand, they began to give life to the perceived notion of what it means to be a global citizen. And it was repeated in many of the other visits. I go back to northern Uganda every 3 or 4 months. I see an Army colonel who gave up his commission, took a law degree, and now fights for human rights, at great risk to his own life. See a young woman who is an environmental officer, doesn't even have a bicycle to get around, but is out there every day trying to preserve something, whatever is left of the rainforest. Enormous stands of heroism, day in and day out. And it stands, if you allow me, in stark contrast to the callousness of the plight of others and to a military way of solving problems that become so prevalent in Western societies since September 11th. I found in this small region of Uganda a reflection of the global condition in all its dimensions. Daily threats of insecurity, violence, illness, disease, poverty. And it came to me, standing there in front of that black plaque, that finding a way to protect a child against an Ebola virus in a displaced persons camp is just as important as protecting the right of a commuter getting on an airplane to be free of a terrorist hijacking in New York, or an Israeli teenager in a shopping center, or a Chechen woman who's trying to protect her children and gets killed by landmines. We are common in our citizenship because we all begin to share that same risk and that same threat. You know, 5 days in a distant part of the world is not a lot of time to become conversant with the complexity of life there. But it's enough to remind one of just how close together we are in the world, how our fates are closely intertwined, and that the reality of living in a global society far outpaces our ability to understand it. We're still living in a time warp of perceptions that are out of date. Nation state, sovereignty, all these things no longer really fit the world that we now occupy. And the stories I just told you all fit and speak to a human condition experienced by thousands, millions around the world. And this experience poses the mysterious question of how far does our range of personal, individual responsibility extend, of why the fate of one group of people should concern that of another. Do we draw the line with our family, with our neighborhood, with our community, our city, our province, our country? Do we put up frontiers to keep the problems out? How far do we reach to be our sisters and brothers' keepers? And does our conscience and our sense of right take us as far as the crowded camps of northern Uganda or the child soldiers in Colombia or the terrorist cells that plague the modern world? And there's many answers to that, too many answers, which is why the center here is so important. Too many answers to that question are being fueled by racisms, fundamentalisms, nationalisms, and most of all, being faced with indifference. We just don't pay attention. You know, the author Sivy Ozick said, hoping to confer no hurt, indifference finally grows lethal. And I'll tell you how that indifference expresses itself in today's world. There's an old Roman law called homo sacer, developed by the Romans to say there's one class of citizens who are endowed with full rights, privileges, protections. And there's another group of people who are invisible, who are not included, who are not part of that legal regime. They are outside the pale. And their death or their torture or their violation are of little concern to them because they really aren't considered to be humans. They are simply there. Now let me ask you this. Are we, at this day and age, so far advanced where the Romans were 2,000 years ago, are we in danger of establishing our own version of a rule of homo sacer where we say one part of the world counts, our part, and the other doesn't? And so for the refugees and the victims of ethnic war, or the Taliban prisoners, or the numbers whose plights are simply put in a black box where nobody gets entry, we are in fact creating a double standard of citizenship and a double standard of legal requirement. The world has become much less safe for civilians, and yet the tools that we use to govern ourselves are far less relevant to the intermingling of our common fate. And frankly, I don't think we yet fully understand the responsibilities and obligations of being a global citizen. Too often we do things on the cheap. Too often we're afraid to take the tough commitments. Too often we're afraid to debate. And even when there's an obvious demand, we simply turn the TV switch. And I say this to you because we, as part of this Canadian community, are very much now part of a period of political change in our national governing structure. How much and how far is the debate about global citizenship being part of that transition? How much is it influencing and shaping what we do to reach out to those kinds of responsibilities we have? So I just want to talk for a few more moments about an alternative. An alternative that I think stands in contrast to the state of the fanatic, those people who have put together a linkage founded in terror, invisible to the sight, attempting to destroy everything that stands in their way. But I also think we need an alternative to the warrior state, which believes that the use of military power is primarily and only the way to come to grips with the threat that those terrorists raise. As a result, I think it's time that we had some new navigation guides, that we need some new tools. We need an alternative to flexing one's muscles, to undertaking preemptive strikes, to breaking the rules of law. It's about time, at least we in this community began to think, is there another way? Can we strike a different course? Can we use the principle of dead reckoning in navigation to find some form on the horizon? Let me offer by first giving you a quick indication that during the period when I was in government, as we were wrestling with all the issues about how do you come to grips with the aftermath of the Cold War, we understood increasingly the risks and threats to Canadians weren't arising from aggression across borders, weren't arising from huge military powers. They were coming from a terrorist or a drug dealer or a criminal, and that therefore we should begin to fully exercise the notion of human security. And what does that mean? Simply means that you take the security and risk of individuals as a priority, not the security of the nation state. A nation state which is a legal concept that arose out of the Westphalian system, put lots of nice sort of words around it, had lots of lawyers and judges talk about it for 200 years, but does it really apply anymore? If the real risk is to the security of vulnerable civilians and individuals, what can we do to reorganize the system to come to grips with it? It led to things like the Landmines Campaign, which got a lot of sort of caustic comment from the academics who said, oh, what does it matter? Well, what it matters is that between 1997 when we signed it and 2003 when we now have it, we save about 40,000 lives a year. That's the difference that it makes. That's the difference that it makes. And let me just flash forward to two other things that we as Canadians midwife, that we have a certain paternity about. At the end of the Kosovo War, when we were asked to intervene militarily, and I was one of those that made a recommendation to my cabinet to do so, I was uneasy. I didn't like it. I spent a lot of time with the pastor of my own church trying to resolve just war questions. Could it be justified? But what I came to realize is that if you have a principle of protection of individuals, then at some point you're going to be called to task. You can't avoid sometimes using hard power. But it should be done by rules. It has to be done by agreement. It has to be done based upon consensus. So we set up a commission called the Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty. And it came out with a report. Bad timing, came out just after the September 11th attacks. But you know, sometimes a report has an idea. And let me tell you, politics works on ideas. They don't always flourish and flower, but if the idea is there, they can grow. And what was the idea? I'm going to quote from the report just a minute. It said we must redefine sovereignty as a responsibility to protect, to shift the perspective from what sovereignty endows what the state can do to its responsibility to protect its citizens. And it says then, such a responsibility implies an evaluation of the issue from the perspective of the victim, not the intervener. If a state cannot provide protection or is the author of the crime, then it forfeits its sovereign right, and the international community steps in, not just to protect, but to prevent and rebuild. As the latter part of this comment makes, the responsibility to prevent and rebuild are as crucial as the responsibility to intervene and protect. Ask yourself this question. If these principles had been in place, had been accepted by the United Nations, would we now have an invasion in Iraq and the quagmire that we're now trying to resolve of how to get out of it? Recognition, Iraqi citizens were being badly abused by their governments. At the same time, a recognition that before one intervenes, you have to exhaust all the other options. You have to develop a certain degree of a consensus. You have to assure that the means are appropriate to the problems you're facing. And you have to meet certain tests about the egregious nature of that abuse. In other words, we are trying to basically turn the notion of sovereignty on its head and begin to establish a basis, a formula, a paradigm, if you like, around which we can begin to redefine the way in which we provide protection and our responsibilities as citizens in this 21st century. And this is a Canadian idea. This is as important as our peacekeeping proposals, as important as, developing the telescope. All those things are part of our paternity. And what was fascinating in this week's debate in the General Assembly is how often this began to recur. The Secretary General mentioned it. Other world leaders said, maybe we should start looking at the responsibility to protect as a way of dealing with it, because once you start doing that, it leads immediately to a reform of the General Assembly, giving them responsibility to determine when to intervene. It means you begin providing new instruments at the UN, such as a constabulary, so you don't have UN buildings bombed because somebody's busy doing something elsewhere. You have blue helmets to protect aid workers and international institutions, and to be able to intervene to disarm countries like Iraq or Iran who are unlawfully arming themselves. Is that out of the box? Absolutely. Are people in Security Council prepared to accept it? Absolutely no way, because they like the way the world works, because they control it. But I'm telling you, as Canadians, we have an opportunity, because we have now worked to develop the idea, to translate that idea and make it work, to implement it, to show how it can work in the Middle East, to show how it can work in Colombia, to show how it can work in Liberia or the Congo or northern Uganda. That means that the universities have to put their minds to work about how, as global citizens, they put their intellectual power to work. It means NGO and civic communities in Canada have to get together to begin to work about how we develop a consensus in this country to support it. It means we have to begin thinking about our own democracy. That if we are going to exercise our understanding of what a global citizen is, we can't let our own citizenship in our own country begin to go fallow. begin to deteriorate. We can't let a political system simply become an electoral machine without any opportunity for access or openness or transparency or debate. Let me just give you an example. In the book that I've got, I put out some things that we as Canadians are going to have to do if we're going to live up to our responsibilities. We need to change, have fundamental electoral reform in this country. You know, I loved being a constituency politician. It was great. But I also realized it was a fundamentally unfair system, that all kinds of people would never be represented in a first-past-the-post constituency-based system. It's time we thought about moving to a hybrid system of population. And why? Because first, urban areas would finally get decent representation, and most importantly, women would get proper representation. I think it is a real, serious scar on our democracy that the level of representation of women in our legislatures and our chambers has stalled at 20 or 25%, because I got to tell you, from my own experience, women do bring a different view about how the world and the globe should work, and it's about time they got the right to exercise it and represent it. But we can't do that till we reform our political system. This is not a democratic deficit, this is real democracy. Two other quick things. If you want to have an independent foreign policy, it doesn't come cheap. We can't say that guns and butter or taxes and health care are the only things that count. We have allowed our diplomatic, trade, defense systems to fray away. We simply, as a group of people, have not put the investment into our international global responsibility it deserves. Our diplomatic corps is stretched so thin that it's like a thin rubber band. We are unrepresented in large parts of the world. Our foreign aid programs, I don't have to tell you, are about half of what they should be. Our defense system, and I always supported an increase in defense, not to buy toys for the boys so they could play on missile defense, but to provide the capacity to have a lift, a rapid reaction force that could go to Liberia or Uganda or the Middle East in an effective way with the right intelligence, and being able to do so based upon a Canadian sense of security. It means that even in this age of terrorism, we have to start investing about how do we bring a large number of other Canadians in. We don't simply have to use public servants or people in soldiers. We have a reserve system that has gone unattended. What's better than a citizen soldier to help keep the peace around the world? What is better than to have civilian volunteers working at civil affairs in Bosnia so they can help recreate countries that need to be rebuilding? You know, the scope for us to become applied peace builders is enormous. The potential is incredible. Let me give you one other place where I think we have a special role. If I had to take anything out, it would be the whole need to begin developing a system of global education on peace. This is not some halcyon far off the moon, but the advent of modern-day information technology, connecting people around the world to talk about what divides them, what shares, the kind of work that the Mauro Center is going to do, now needs to be extended by the enormous power of this new tool that we have. I saw a fascinating example in my constituency, where a group of young kids from Grosvenor School were hooked up with their counterparts in Mexico and the United States, talking about the decline of the monarch butterfly. They communicated every day about the butterfly dying out. And as a result of their daily communication, they began to mobilize local politicians, local systems, till they got Mexico, southern Texas, and parts of Manitoba to begin caring about the preservation of butterfly. These were young people talking to each other in their own way, by their own standards. It could be developed multifold. And yet, think of this. Last year in this country, we spent, I think a guy in Vancouver told me, about $1 billion on developing software games so we could find out more effective ways why Zorg could shoot up Zong. Do you know how much we spent on the public side of developing the software for global communications and education? I think this room could count the dollars on their feet and hands. It's a classic case of public poverty and private affluence at work, and yet here we have a chance as a privileged country with this kind of an opportunity to really begin developing a network, a linkage of connecting young people in particular around the world through our universities and our schools so that they begin to deal with one another. And as we go around moaning and lamenting the great cultural divide, the great sort of separation of Islamists and Christians and all this kind of sort of silliness that we're getting into, the reality is we're not doing anything about it to bring them together. And it's about time, again, that it's not government who just does it. It is our educational institutions. It's our corporate sector. It's our software technology who begin to have the tools to begin wiring and webbing us up in an interactive way so our young people can begin to talk about the need to be common global citizens. That's the kind of thing that we as Canadians can do to make a difference. That's the kind of thing that I believe we have to be thinking about, not that's going to change the world in the next 6 weeks or 6 months, that will begin to define, in a way, a form of citizenship for the generation that's born in this millennium century. That they are children of a borderless world. They don't see the way I see things, in frontier terms, in border terms, in security terms. They see a world that's connected. And we have to give them the opportunity to make that new understanding take hold. When I think of the amount of money that we're spending today, $5 billion, building up fences on our border, as opposed to building up an educational system to bring people together, I'm saying, are we really providing this for the security of our generation? And then the notion of generational responsibility, of our making decisions now that will lift forward into the decisions that our children and grandchildren will make, is one that carries with it enormous potential. It's the precautionary principle we all have to exercise. That's, again, a definition of being a global citizen today. Not a citizen just in the here and now, but a citizen for the future, to make sure that all the elements to enable today's generation to be safe, secure, in a just world are put in place. Because if we don't put it in place now, they've got too many odds against them. What I've presented here is just the beginning. It's just a scratching of the surface of the kind of discussion that we need to have. It's just some of the ways that we can work out to develop a strategic fit for Canada that makes sense of what we can do best, to examine carefully what assets we bring to bear. We're not a huge military power. We don't have a whiff of manifest destiny. But we are a community which over the years has worked out its differences, who has established political institutions that respect group rights, that we understand the importance of public investment, that we have cities that we can change and shape in a way that provides security and tolerance. We have a business sector that has become global in its outlook and increasingly confident about its abilities. And we have a group of young people who see the world as no others see it in our time and place, which is a world looking from the outside in, not from the outside out. That they see the world from where the spaceships start, see it as a whole, as a coherent area. And I have a belief that if we can ground those assets that we have as Canadians in a sense of democratic practices, both home and abroad, that if we follow human security principles, which is the protection of individuals, that that's the best means, the most important means of controlling the global underworld, the criminals and the terrorists and the smugglers. It's also grounded in my belief that it's the right thing for Canadians to do, that we can make a difference as Canadians, that we should be working to enhance, not reduce our freedoms. We should not be assuming automatically that the only policy for us is to follow in the slipstream of our powerful southern neighbor. We should not fall prey to the American cheerleaders here in Canada who say the only thing we can do is integrate the security and integrate economics and go along, because in fact, by going along, we will simply give up. We will not be able to add that special quality, that special sense of who we are and what we can do. We're only one community amongst many, but we can offer ideas and skills and resources and commitment to work with others to find solutions, peaceful solutions, along with a sense of quiet optimism. Felipe Fernandez Armesto has just written a little book called The Americas, where he traces the history of North and South America over the last 3 centuries. Here's what he said. Of all the places I looked at, of all the countries I've visited, Canada is close to being most people's ideal country. What an incredible asset to have. But one thing basic, political and law will tell you, if you have a privilege, then you're obliged to share it. That if you have a right, you also have an obligation. We have an obligation to take that best of all possible worlds that we live in and provide a certain beacon towards a horizon where security and fairness may be justice beckon. Graham Greene once wrote that once in a while a door opens and lets the future in. This is such a moment. It's time to follow that old saying, carpe diem, seize the day. And if we Canadians are prepared to exercise our burgeoning, evolving understanding of being global citizens, then maybe in the not-too-distant future, we can say to Angela in the jungles of Colombia, you can cry again. Thank you very much. Thank you.